All right, so are you ready to dive into a moment in history that most people haven't heard of?
Yeah.
But it had huge GE ripple effects.
Yeah.
We're talking about the Italo-Ethiopian Crisis of 1935.
Absolutely.
You with me?
This isn't just some obscure event.
Okay.
It's a window into understanding international relations, colonialism,
Yeah.
and the road to World War II.
And what's so cool is that Ethiopia was this beacon of independence in Africa.
Yeah,
They actually defeated a European power in battle back in 1896.
that's right.
Can you imagine?
The Battle of Adwa.
How shocking that must have been at the time.
It was a truly remarkable event.
Yeah.
Imagine this European powers at the height of their imperial power, armed with advanced weaponry, were decisively defeated by an African army.
Wow.
It sent shockwaves across the world and challenged prevailing assumptions about racial hierarchies and military capabilities.
I bet that victory was a huge source of pride for Ethiopia.
Oh, absolutely.
But I can only imagine how humiliating it must have been for Italy.
The defeat at Adwa became a national trauma for Italy, a stain on their national pride that they were determined to erase.
Yeah.
And decades later, a man named Benito Mussolini
Oh, yeah.
would exploit that wounded pride to fuel his own ambitions.
Ah, yes. Mussolini. He was all about making Italy great again, reviving the Roman Empire, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Mussolini's fascist ideology was deeply rooted in this idea of restoring Italy to its former glory.
Mm-hmm.
He envisioned a new Roman Empire stretching across the Mediterranean and beyond.
Okay.
And in his eyes, Ethiopia, with its strategic location and perceived resources, was the perfect target to realize this grand vision.
So Ethiopia wasn't just a random target. It was about feeding into a much larger ambition. But it wasn't just about historical grievances and imperial fantasies, was it?
No, there were other factors at play as well.
Okay.
Italy was struggling economically during the Great Depression.
Right.
Mussolini needed a way to distract from domestic problems and rally the population around the common cause. He painted a picture of Ethiopia as a land of opportunity, rich in resources, and ripe for Italian settlement, even though that wasn't entirely accurate.
It sounds like he was using a classic tactic of playing on people's fears and aspirations.
He was a master of propaganda.
Yeah.
And knew how to manipulate public opinion.
Yeah.
And let's not forget about Italy's growing population at the time.
Right.
Mussolini needed an outlet for that pressure,
Yeah.
a place to expand.
Okay, so we've got this potent mix of revenge ambition, economic woes, and population pressure.
Right.
But wasn't there an international organization in place that was supposed to prevent this kind of aggression? The League of Nations, right?
You're right. The League of Nations was established after World War I with the goal of preventing future conflicts and upholding international law.
Right.
But unfortunately, their track record was far from perfect.
Oh.
Their failure to effectively address Japan's invasion of Manchuria in 1931 had exposed critical weakness.
Okay.
They lacked the will and the means to enforce their own rules.
So Mussolini saw that the League of Nations wasn't exactly a force to be reckoned with and thought, maybe I can get away with this too.
It's very likely that Mussolini saw the League's weakness as a green light for his own ambitions.
Yeah.
And to make matters worse, the European powers, particularly Britain and France, were preoccupied with the rising threat of Nazi Germany.
So they had their own problems brewing.
Exactly.
Okay.
In 1935, they formed the Stresa Front with Italy, an agreement aimed at containing Hitler's aggression.
Oh.
This meant that they were willing to appease Mussolini to a certain extent, rather than risk pushing him closer to Hitler.
So they were basically caught between a rock and a hard place,
Right.
trying to contain one dictator while inadvertently emboldening another.
That's a good way to put it. They were walking a tightrope, and their hesitation to confront Mussolini would have dire consequences.
Wow.
And then to add fuel to the fire, there was the Wall incident in December 1934.
What happened at Wall Wall?
Wall was a remote oasis near the ill-defined border between Italian Somaliland and Ethiopia. There was a clash between Italian and Ethiopian forces, resulting in casualties on both sides.
Oh, no.
Now, this incident in itself was relatively minor.
So not really a reason to launch a full-scale invasion.
Exactly.
Wow.
But Mussolini seized upon this incident as a pretext for war.
Oh, jeez.
He used it to whip up nationalist sentiment at home, portraying Ethiopia as the aggressor and Italy as the victim.
It sounds like he was looking for any excuse to justify his action.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And the international community's muted response only emboldened him further.
Oh, wow.
The stage was set for a confrontation that would have far-reaching consequences.
So we've got the historical backdrop, Mussolini's ambitions, the economic factors, the League of Nations weakness, and the anxieties of the European powers.
Right.
And then, bam, the Wall Hall incident happens.
Exactly.
And suddenly all these forces collide. It's like a powder keg just waiting for a spark.
That's a great analogy.
Wow.
And unfortunately, that spark would ignite a conflict that would have devastating consequences for Ethiopia and send shockwaves across the world.
Okay, so we've talked about the powder keg of tensions.
Right.
And how the wall incident was the spark that ignited the conflict.
Yeah.
But what happened next?
Right.
I mean, Ethiopia had defeated Italy before, so did they put up a fight this time?
Oh, they absolutely. Did you see the spirit of Adwa? That victory against all odds was deeply ingrained in Ethiopian culture.
Right.
But this time, they were facing a different Italy.
Okay.
A nation transformed by fascist ideology and armed with modern weaponry.
So it wasn't just about sheer determination this time around.
No, it wasn't. The Italians under Mussolini employed a brutal and technologically advanced war machine.
Oh, wow.
We're talking tanks,
Aircraft.
poison gas,
Gas.
weapons that Ethiopia simply couldn't match.
That's horrific. Was that even allowed back then?
Sadly, it was. International laws regarding chemical weapons were in their infancy.
Wow.
And Mussolini, desperate to secure a swift victory, disregarded any semblance of ethical warfare.
Gee.
The use of poison gas against Ethiopian soldiers and civilians alike was a chilling reminder of the horrors that modern technology could unleash.
It's hard to imagine the terror that those facing such an onslaught must have felt. So did Ethiopia just crumble under this overwhelming force?
Despite the immense challenges they faced, the Ethiopians resisted fiercely. Think about it. They were defending their homeland, their very way of life, against an invading force determined to subjugate them. They fought with incredible courage and tenacity, employing guerrilla tactics to harass the Italian army.
So even though they were outmatched technologically, they still found ways to resist.
Exactly. And their resistance wasn't limited to the battlefield. Emperor Haile Selassie, forced into exile, became a powerful voice on the world stage.
Oh.
He traveled to Geneva, the seat of the League of Nations,
Yeah.
and delivered a passionate plea for international support, condemning Italy's aggression and exposing their use of chemical weapons.
That's incredible. So did the world listen? Did the League of Nations finally step up and take action?
Well, they did impose some sanctions on Italy. But as we saw with the Manchurian crisis, their actions were hesitant and ultimately ineffective.
So what were these sanctions and why didn't they work?
The sanctions were mostly symbolic,
Okay.
targeting things like arms sales and financial transactions, but they deliberately excluded crucial materials like oil, which was essential for Italy's war machine.
Why would they exclude something so vital? It's like trying to stop a speeding car by only applying the parking brake.
The decision to exclude oil was largely driven by political and economic considerations.
Okay.
Some nations were hesitant to fully commit to sanctions for fear of damaging their own economies. Others worried that pushing Mussolini too far would drive him closer to Hitler, further destabilizing Europe.
So once again, they were caught between a rock and a hard place. Did they even try to pressure Mussolini through diplomatic channels?
There were certainly attempts at diplomacy, but they were largely overshadowed by the fear of escalating the situation. Remember, Europe was on edge watching Hitler's rise to power with growing apprehension. The last thing they wanted was another major conflict.
So in a way, their fear of war actually contributed to the war happening in Ethiopia.
It's a tragic irony, isn't it? Their inaction, driven by the desire to avoid a larger conflict, ultimately emboldened Mussolini and gave him the green light to continue his brutal campaign in Ethiopia.
And what about Ethiopia's allies? Did they receive any support from other countries?
While there was widespread sympathy for Ethiopia's plight, material support was limited.
Right.
Some individuals inspired by Ethiopia's resistance volunteered to fight alongside them.
Wow.
But on a governmental level, most countries remained on the sidelines, offering words of condemnation, but little in the way of concrete assistance.
That must have been incredibly disheartening for the Ethiopians to see the world standing by while their country was being ravaged.
It was a profound betrayal of the ideals of collective security that the League of Nations was supposed to uphold. And this sense of betrayal would have a lasting impact on Ethiopia's view of the international community.
So we've got this incredibly brave resistance facing overwhelming odds.
Yeah.
A passionate plea for help from Emperor Haile Selassie.
Right.
And the world basically turning a blind eye. It's a pretty bleak picture so far.
It's a dark chapter in history, no doubt. But even in the midst of this tragedy, there were glimmers of hope. The Ethiopian people's determination to resist, even when facing seemingly insurmountable obstacles, would inspire future generations fighting for freedom and self-determination.
That's a powerful thought, that even in defeat, there can be seeds of future victory.
Yeah.
But what about the immediate aftermath? What happened after Italy occupied Ethiopia? Did the world just move on? We left off with a pretty somber picture. Ethiopia occupied the world, seemingly turning a blind eye to their plight. It's hard to imagine what it must have been like to live through that period. Did the Ethiopians ever give up hope?
That's what's so remarkable about this story. Even under Italian occupation, the spirit of resistance never truly died. Ethiopians continued to fight back, engaging in acts of sabotage of underground movements and keeping the flame of independence alive.
So it was more than just symbolic resistance. They were actively working to undermine Italian rule.
Absolutely. And this unwavering spirit had ripple effects far beyond Ethiopia's borders. Remember how we talked about the shockwaves from the Battle of Adwa?
Yeah.
Well, imagine how the world saw this small African nation standing up to Mussolini, this symbol of fascist power.
I can see how that would be inspiring, especially for other countries struggling under colonial rule.
It was a beacon of hope for oppressed people around the world. Think of it. If Ethiopia could resist, could defy this powerful European empire, then maybe, just maybe, they could too. Ethiopia's struggle became a symbol of anti-colonial resistance, feeding into movements for independence across Africa and beyond.
So even in occupation, Ethiopia was planting the seeds for a future where colonialism would be challenged on a global scale. That's a pretty incredible legacy.
It is, and this legacy was further cemented when Ethiopia was finally liberated in 1941 during World War II. With the help of British forces, Emperor Haile Selassie returned to his throne, marking a triumphant end to years of fascist occupation.
It's almost poetic. The nation that was abandoned by the international community during the crisis ends up being liberated as part of the fight against fascism in World War II.
It's a testament to the resilience of the Ethiopian people and the enduring power of their struggle. And the story of Ethiopia's liberation became a powerful symbol for those fighting for independence in the decades that followed. Leaders like Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana and Jomo Kenyatta in Kenya drew inspiration from Ethiopia's fight, seeing it as a blueprint for their own movements.
So this seemingly isolated event in the 1930s had these long-lasting consequences, shaping the course of African decolonization and inspiring generations of activists and leaders.
Exactly. It highlights how interconnected history is, how events that might seem distant and insignificant can have a profound impact on the world. And it reminds us that the fight for freedom and self-determination is a continuous one with echoes that reverberate across time and space.
Speaking of echoes, we've talked a lot about how the world failed to support Ethiopia during the crisis. What about the League of Nations? Did this debacle have any lasting consequences for them?
The League of Nations was already reeling from its failure to stop Japan's aggression in Manchuria. But the Italo-Ethiopian Crisis dealt a fatal blow to its credibility. It showed the world that the League was toothless, incapable of enforcing its own rules or protecting its members from aggression.
So it was like the final nail in the coffin for this idea of collective security.
In a sense, yes. The League of Nations limped along for a few more years, but it never recovered from the damage inflicted by these crises. The outbreak of World War II in 1939 confirmed its ultimate failure.
It's tragic, really. The world had this chance to create a system that could prevent another devastating war, and it just didn't work.
It's a reminder that good intentions aren't enough. You need the will, the mechanisms, and the unity to back them up. And sadly, the world lacked those things in the 1930s.
So we've explored the lead up to the crisis, the invasion itself, the resistance, the global impact, and the long-term consequences. It's been a whirlwind tour through a complex and often heartbreaking period of history. But what do you think is the most important takeaway for our listeners? What's the one thing you hope they'll remember from this deep dive?
I think the most important lesson is that history is not just a collection of dates and events. It's about choices, actions, and consequences. The Italo-Ethiopian Crisis shows us how individual choices like Mussolini's ambition can have a ripple effect, shaping the destiny of nations and the course of history.
And it shows how the choices of the international community, or the lack thereof, can have profound consequences as well.
Exactly. The world's inaction in the face of Italian aggression had a devastating impact on Ethiopia and contributed to the rise of fascism and the outbreak of World War II. It's a stark reminder that we cannot stand idly by while injustice occurs. We must learn from the mistakes of the past and strive to create a world where international cooperation and the rule of law prevail.
It's a powerful message, and one that resonates deeply today as we face new challenges and conflicts around the world. Thank you for guiding us through this incredibly insightful deep dive into the Italo-Ethiopian crisis. I know I've learned a lot, and I hope our listeners have too.
It's been my pleasure. I always find it fascinating to delve into these forgotten corners of history and uncover the connections that shape our world. And I hope that by understanding the past, we can make more informed and ethical choices in the present.
Well said. And for our listeners, if this deep dive has sparked your curiosity, we encourage you to continue exploring. There's a wealth of information out there waiting to be discovered. Keep questioning, keep learning, and keep engaging with the complexities of history. Until next time, keep diving deep.